Hi, it's Laura at Aquamarine18. Thanks for stopping by my channel today. I am here with a video on designing tarot spreads for yourself for the new and full moon, or according to the moon phases. And this video is part of a broader series called 28 Days of the Moon, which was started by my friend Maha at Maha's Treasure Box. I am going to link below to Maha's channel where you can find the full schedule and list of all of the channels participating and the topics that they will be covering. So thank you so much, of course, to Maha for asking me. I was very excited to participate. Before I get started, I wanted to just share a bit of a trajectory of where this video is going to go. And I'm going to timestamp this kind of table of contents for the video, if you will. Because if you know me, you know that I can ramble forever, so I don't know how long this is going to be, but I want folks to be able to skip ahead if they want to. So I'll talk a little bit more about the series and my topic by way of introduction. I want to think about some of the reasons why we might work with the full moon for introspection, and introspection is the act or process of looking into oneself. And so why I work with the moon in this way. I want to discuss some of the reasons why we might design our own tarot spreads for this, as opposed to using pre-designed spreads made by other folks, which are widely available. I do think there's something really special about designing our own, so I really wanted to share that part of my practice. Then I want to give a kind of 5-step approach to designing your own spreads for the new and full moons. And finally, I will share my spread that I've designed for myself for the full moon eclipse in Capricorn, which is happening on July 5th. At least in my time zone, it's July 5th. Maybe it's a different day somewhere else. But July 5th just happened to be the day that Maha was able to fit me in the schedule. So I thought I would take that as a sign to work with that full moon eclipse in Capricorn as my example, and then just a little short conclusion. So that's where I'll be going. And I hope you will stick with me throughout this. So I was really excited to be asked by Maha to participate in this series. She had been saying, that there really isn't a lot of content out there, at least not on YouTube, in terms of working with the moon phases. But speaking for myself, that is something that is really integral to my spiritual practice and kind of wellness or self-care practice as well. And so I was really happy to jump into this conversation. The moon is really important to me. For folks who don't know, Aquamarine 18 refers to the moon card in tarot, and Aquamarine is my birthstone. I'm a Pisces, so I feel very much moon oriented. So this is a great chance to talk about something that is near and dear to me, and to share a part of my regular personal practice with you that I feel comfortable sharing, and that was the first thing that came to mind when I heard from Maha that there was interest in making this series of videos about, in different ways, working with the moon and the moon phases. So I'm hopeful that my talking about my own practices and approaches is, at the very least of interest, and perhaps something you'll be interested in trying for yourself. In designing this video and thinking about how this video would go, I've really tried to aim for something that is accessible. I know, very much firsthand how daunting astrology is. Like, if there's any area that the more I learn, the more I know that I don't know, that's astrology for sure. I am far, far, far from an expert, just learning, and so I'm not going to presume any astrological knowledge or really even knowledge about the moon here, though the strategy for designing spreads that I'm going to share does kind of predicate itself on some willingness to do a little bit of reading on your own, but certainly no prior knowledge. And same thing with spread design. So I know that for folks, particularly beginners to tarot, the idea of designing your own spread might be a little bit intimidating as well. but I'm hopeful that this approach that I'm going to share will be something that is, welcoming and approachable for anyone who's interested in it. And again, I'm going to talk about the full moon with a lunar eclipse in Capricorn happening on July 5th. Today, if this is the day that the video is releasing, though I am filming actually quite a bit ahead, so I've designed my spread for that July 5th, but I'm sharing a process that you can work with anytime. And I will also just note before launching in more to the content of the video that I've made two very, very basic handouts, which I've put in the description box that I'm hoping, if everything works correctly, you'll be able to download as PDFs. And these are just very, very basic, not particularly aesthetically pleasing handouts, but the idea is that you can fill in, kind of fill in the blanks for yourself, some of the things that I'll be talking about working with, including your own associations for the signs of the zodiac, as well as some of your own associations for the moon phases. So if you would like to do that, feel free to use those, or to not use those. I'm sure there are much more pretty fancy versions of this, and it's mostly just fill in the blanks. So, but they're there if you'd like to work with those. I thought about, but actually decided against making a printout version of my own spread that I've designed for the full moon of July 5th, the full moon in Capricorn, because the idea of this video is really to give some ideas of how you can go about designing your own spread for you that will be personalized, right? So I am going to share at the end the spread positions that I've put into my spread for this full moon, but you can write them down and you can use them if you like, but I decided against making a handout on my spread because this really isn't about me making a spread and giving it to you. It's about finding ways to make your own. So the first kind of question that I thought might be coming up for folks is the question of why work with moon phases at all, right? Why work with the cycles of the moon in your practice, whatever that practice might be? And for me, there's a couple of reasons that I work with the cycles of the moon, very strongly in my practice, right? One is just that I feel like moon cycles are a reasonable, manageable time frame when it comes to things like checking in with yourself, setting some goals, bringing those goals to fruition, working on, doing some self-work. It's a lot shorter, to work with a moon phase than to work with something like a calendar year or to work with even the solstices and equinoxes. These are spread quite far apart. And I do work with those as well, but I really like just the length of time of a cycle of the moon as a time frame to do introspective work in, because I find that it is manageable in ways that something like setting New Year's resolutions and then revisiting them 12 months later feels a lot less so for me. So that's one reason. Another reason is that I like to have a time frame that is in no way aligned with my kind of work schedule, which is mostly aligned to a school year. I organize my life largely in terms of my work around a school year because of the field of work that I'm in. And I like having for my spiritual life, my religious life, a kind of framework of time that in no way corresponds to that. It helps me to step out of that work all the time mindset when I'm kind of going inward and thinking about myself and my needs and how I'm doing. It divorces itself from that school and calendar year time frame, which I really appreciate. And it also aligns nicely with my acknowledgement of or celebration of the solstices and equinoxes, which I mentioned, which I do include in my practice as well. And these also have an astrological basis, right, in terms of where what the sun is doing. So I think that the lunar cycles are a good companion to that. And I really like, the moon as cyclical, as a way of decentering linear time from my practice. I hope that makes sense. the idea of engaging in self-exploration in a way that is cyclical and that returns to itself, as opposed to in this kind of linear, progress-oriented kind of a way. Right? That is important to me. Okay? And I also think that doing this kind of introspective work with regards to the moon, for me, really is expressive of and aligns with how I understand the moon itself and the moon in astrology. I'll talk more about that later. So the second question that I thought of that might be one that folks would be wondering why I would make this topic is, why would I design my own spreads for the moon phases, right? You can, of course, go online and find any number of amazing tarot readers and creators sharing publicly spreads that they've designed around new and full moons, right? They're out there. I'm sure we've all seen them, right? And there's absolutely nothing wrong with working with those whatsoever. I am grateful to folks who make resources like that freely available, or not freely available, as something you can purchase, spreads to work with the moon cycles. I think that's great. But there are a couple of reasons that, for me, designing my own spreads for introspective work in particular has become really important to me, to the point that I don't work with pre-designed, spreads designed by anyone else for this purpose of new and full moon check-ins with myself at all. I only work with spreads I've designed myself at this point. And there's a couple of reasons for that, right? One reason is that I'm studying astrology, and I think that working with spread design around new and full moons can be a great way of learning at least some components of astrology. So learning about the different signs, learning how the moon behaves in different signs, which can translate into learning something about a birth chart or about transit astrology, right? Learning about eclipses. When you start to learn by doing, which I think spread design is learning by doing, I think that that's really valuable, and that's certainly been valuable for me in terms of working on, at a very beginner level, learning something about astrology in a kind of tangible, practical, ongoing way, as opposed to just reading a book, though I'm reading lots of books as well. The second reason that I think designing your own spread can be really helpful is that it will reflect your own beliefs about the world, beliefs about the moon, beliefs about tarot and what it can do, and your own needs in ways that a more, generic spread, in that it's a spread designed for nobody in particular or everybody, can't, right? I frequently found myself, when I was more so working with spreads designed by others, that there would be spread positions in there that just, there's nothing wrong with them, but that they don't work for me, right? That they don't align with how I think about the world or how I think about myself or what I want to do a reading with, right? An easy example here is that a lot of spreads will make reference to concepts like the divine masculine and divine feminine. These concepts are not a part of my practice at all. So while those spreads might be really, really great for folks who do work with those kind of concepts, I don't, so they feel really jarringly irrelevant to me, right? In ways that when I design a spread for myself, I know that it's going to fit, it's going to feel like a home for me. That, is a really valuable thing, I think. And the last reason that I will say in terms of designing your own spreads for new and full moons is that you can incorporate continuity here, right? Because we know that the moon moves in cycles, right? And, from a new moon and waxes to a full moon and wanes down to a new moon again. So for me, a big part of my practice here, when I'm designing, say, a spread for a full moon, which I'm going to get into in a moment, is looking back and seeing where I was at the time of the new moon previously. And maybe even the full moon previous to that, right? So I can see, it doesn't really make sense to me when we're thinking about something like personal development or spiritual exploration, spiritual development, to treat that as kind of a series of one-off moments, right? There's a new moon and then there's a full moon and then there's a new moon and then there's a full moon. No, you want to be looking back and seeing, where you were at and how you've shifted, in light of where you were at previously. And I think that, inevitably, when we're working with spreads designed by others, the questions that make up the spread positions aren't going to do that for us, right? Because as someone who's creating a spread and posting it, online or whatever it is, doesn't know what I experienced or learned about myself or drew out of myself at the time of my last reading, right? Of course, how could they, right? But if I design a spread for myself for this full moon, I can look back on the last new moon and, think accordingly about what I want to explore this time. And so that's always what I'm doing. And I'll get to that towards the end of the video. So that's the kind of why, right? Why one might decide to design. Decide to design. That's a wordy one. Why one might decide to design full and new moon introspective or self-analytical or self-exploratory spreads at new and full moon times for themselves, right? And in titling this, I will just say, segue, that in naming this with regards to full and new moon, that expresses when I do this for myself, right? I always do readings for myself at new and full moon, but there's no reason that this kind of 5-part strategy for spread design that I'm going to share that you couldn't design a spread around a first quarter moon, right? You absolutely could. That's just not something that at this time is currently a focal point of my practice. So I've named it full and new moon, but in no way is that intended to be restrictive, right? Restrictive or prescriptive. Prescriptive is often restrictive, in my opinion. So going on, I've come up with 5 steps for designing spreads for self-exploration for the new and full moon. And those spreads, and I've listed them all in the description box below for the timestamps, are to consider the moon itself, to consider the moon's phase, to consider the moon's features, to consider yourself, and then to just bring it all together at the end, right? So those are the 5 steps that I want to walk through, how I've gone through these steps to come up with a spread for the full moon with lunar eclipse and Capricorn for July 5th, the day that you may be watching this video because it's the day that I'm going to be making it public. So step 1 is to consider the moon. And if you have any astrological knowledge or background, this is going to be fairly straightforward to you. But what I mean by considering just the moon is to think about, what does the moon mean to you, right? What does the moon in your birth chart, if you work with that, mean to you? How do you experience the moon as having energies that impact you in different sorts of ways, right? Because to me, if we're going to be doing tarot readings at particular points with reference to the moon, you want to think about, well, what exactly does that mean, right? Why would we do that as opposed to with a different planet in the astrological sense, right? And so for me, the moon has to do with our needs and how we can best fulfill our needs, our emotional needs in particular. The moon for me is very strongly associated with the emotional plane and with emotions, with the element of water, which I also strongly associate with emotions. And of course, you think about the way that the moon so tangibly affects water in the form of tides. And then you think about how much of our selves, our physicalities are comprised of water, right? And I always think about that when I'm feeling this like pull of the moon, right? Very much an emotional one. And the moon for me connects to the unconscious, connects in this way to introspection, right? And why I'm talking about introspective tarot spreads, going into trying to delve into the unconscious, or perhaps the higher self, if you like to think about that language instead. But what's under the surface? What's under the surface of the water of ourselves and our emotional lives that we can't maybe really readily consciously identify, but I think that tools like tarot are so good at getting at, right? And I feel like often, I've had a couple of conversations about this, that the moon so often as a tarot card is given these negative connotations, right? The moon, especially compared to the sun card, the moon is kind of, oh, well, it's confusing and it's being misled and it's tricky, it's deceptive, these kind of quite negative connotations, which I will say I think are gendered, but that's a different video. But for me, I don't see the moon as a negative card in tarot at all. I think of, yes, absolutely, moonlight is perhaps not as fully illuminating. It's shadowy, but that shadowiness is seductive and compelling and fantastical and provocative and inviting and magical and not negative. At least it certainly doesn't have to be negative, right? So these are the kinds of associations I have with the moon. And if you want to write your associations with the moon in the middle of the page that I've put for you to download at the bottom, you can. But I'm sure, you may have these kinds of associations that you draw readily to mind anyway. And so this is really the start of it for me, because it's these meanings that I associate with the moon that are why, when I'm working with moon phases and doing tarot readings that orient themselves towards the moon, those readings are going to be introspective readings. They're going to be about delving into my unconscious, about going, under the water of the emotions, so to speak, and, not about other things that I might also do tarot readings about, right? And it's also something that's very personal for me. So this is where I'm most concerned with designing my own spreads with reference to myself, right? Very, very personal. So that's the first part. And so once you have an understanding of what the moon means to you, how you experience the moon, what your associations with the moon are, is just a basic place to start, then you can think about what the particular moon phases mean to you, right? Because you're not just going to make a spread based on the moon, but based on the particular phase, which is what, my understanding was what the idea of this 28 days of the moon is really about, thinking about moon phases especially. So that's why my first kind of handout creation was this fill in the blank for moon phases. And so here you just want to think about what the moon phase that you're designing a reading for means to you, how you experience that moon phase is affecting you, right? And again, you don't need to have prior knowledge for this, right? If you want to, for example, make a spread for yourself for this full moon, but you're like, where do I start? I don't really, know what the full moon is associated with or what I want to associate with it. Just, go online and consult a couple of different sources and see what kind of keywords jump out at you, and see what resonates with you and see what feels right to you. And different sources, different authors will have slightly different interpretations, for example, of what a full moon might mean. But through looking at a couple of them, you don't need to go out and buy 50 books, though I love buying 50 books, but you can just look anywhere where you can find this information, right? Particularly online, and just go with what makes sense to you, right? I don't think there are right answers here. So you find the meaning of the moon phase that works for you. And so for full moon, for me, I just wrote into my little full moon handout here, I wrote down the keywords of manifest, right? Coming to fruition. You think of the way a full moon has built and waxed over time, and it's manifesting in its fullness. I wrote down harvest. I think of things, that are just potential at the new moon time, coming to fruition and being then available to me in new ways at the full moon. Empower, fullness, pinnacle, amplify, and power. So those are the words that I wrote down for full moon, which probably won't be the exact same ones as you would, but that's where I'm starting from, right? So when I'm making a reading for a full moon, I'm thinking about what is in its fullness at this time, what is at its peak in this time, in terms of my emotional life, in terms of my spiritual life, in terms of, what's going on in my unconscious, right? What is peaking or at its pinnacle? What from previously, from the prior new moon, has really kind of come to a head at the full moon time? That's what I'm thinking of for for a full moon. And so that's going to shape what my reading is going to look like, right? Going into the next step, step 3, I wrote down, consider the moon's features, right? And this is vague and this is broad. And it's deliberately so, because I think once we've thought about the moon phase and what the moon phase might mean to us, there are so many other features of the moon that you can think about to incorporate into a reading, right? So for this full moon in Capricorn, I think about the fact that the moon is becoming full in an earth sign. And when I think about earth as an element, I think about feeling secure. I think about materiality and physicality. I think about what feels comforting and feels physically supportive for me. I think about, day-to-day life, what gets sometimes called, mundane. I don't like the language of mundane, but, work and all the things that you might think of when we think about earth as an element, right? And what is the moon in a full moon going to be doing when it's in an earth sign, right? So that's what I can think of when I think of the element. When I think of Capricorn, and thinking about the signs, I think is a good way to start with this. I wrote down some keywords on my little sheet here for Capricorn, and I wrote down the traits of cardinal earth: pragmatic, authoritative, ambition, determination, self-control, productiveness. So these are some words that I wrote down for Capricorn. And again, here, you don't need to have, strong associations or understandings of zodiac signs. You don't have to know anything about this at all. Find 3 websites and read the entry for Capricorn, and see what's maybe common across those 3 that you can formulate your keywords for Capricorn for, and fill it in that way. You really don't need to have any prior knowledge here. If you can find at this stage, if you're interested in incorporating the sign, if you can find a source that talks about the moon in the signs, that can be really helpful. So Cafe Astrology website does this and has entries on what the different planets do in the signs. A favorite book of mine that does this is Stephen Arroyo's Chart Interpretation Handbook, talks about the different planetary bodies in the signs. So if you're finding that you're having a hard time thinking about how the moon, which is the planet in astrology, it's a planet for me anyway, the emotional, the unconscious, dreams, intuition, all of these things that I associate the moon with. If you have a hard time thinking about how to take that and place it in the context of a sign, there are lots of sources out there that do this, right? That talk about how the moon behaves in different signs. So engage with those sources. They're really, really useful. So that's another feature. This full moon, July 5th, is an eclipse, right? And you might have particular associations with what an eclipse means to you. For me, an eclipse is just a supercharge, right? The lunar eclipse just really amplifies everything that I think about when I think about a full moon. I think about lunar eclipses as really emotional times, potentially really jarring times. I think about the kind of physical image of the moon, which is, a potentially shadowy and elusive moon all the time, but being in shadow, right? And what does that mean? So those are some features that I'm going to take into account, but you can really get, when it comes to thinking about the moon and what it's doing, I feel like you can get as complicated or as straightforward as you want here. Maybe you just want to think about the moon in a particular sign. Maybe you want to skip this step altogether. That's totally fine too. You may be interested in including something like, what is the name of the moon, right? It's the full moons often are spoken of with particular names. So in this case, for the full moon in Capricorn, the buck moon or the thunder moon. Maybe something about that imagery in your mind comes with particular association you want to incorporate. That's great to include too. Maybe you want to read your horoscope. If you read your horoscope, in an email newsletter or anything like that, and you want to take that into account when you make your spread, that's a great place to start. If you have tarot cards of the month that you've picked earlier, you could work with those. You could work with aspects. So I have this Honeycomb Collective personal almanac, and the personal almanac is really cool. It's frankly a little bit beyond my skill when it comes to astrology. But it's a quick reference to all transits affecting your natal chart over the next 12 months. So you get this printed and you share your birth information. And so I know, for example, that on July 5th, when it shows all the transits here, I know that the transiting moon will be the transiting sun, the sun will be forming a trine aspect with my natal sun, which is in Pisces. So if you are maybe a higher degree of expertise in astrology, than I am, perhaps the aspects of that are being formed by the moon at a particular time are something you want to incorporate too. There's really no shortage of ideas here, right? So that's the moon and its features. Step 4 is to consider yourself. And I've called this consider yourself / looking backwards. And I spoke to this a little bit earlier. And here, what I mean is that when I'm designing an introspective spread that is for me and about going into myself and checking in with myself and exploring my depths, I take myself into account, right? Sometimes we talk about tarot and tarot spreads and tarot reading with this kind of aim towards objectivity of particular sorts. This is not language that I like at the best of times, but here, this really doesn't work for me, right? Because here I'm checking in with myself. So I'm going to look at what came up for me at the previous new moon. And when I'm designing a spread for the full moon, I'm going to think about where I've gone from that new moon, and the reading I did at that point to where I am now, right? And this really goes back to the moon having a cycle, right? What's coming from behind us, temporally, and what's coming up, and how is that cycle operating, right? So thinking about associations for a new moon, the last new moon, as opposed to the full moon, which is now, what was there for me or for you that was perhaps just feeling like potential or beginning at the time of the last new moon that maybe has really peaked at this point at the full moon, right? Or what's more available to you now at the full moon that you were just identifying as a possibility at the time of the new moon, right? So I always look back and I read my journal entries. I always journal these spreads from the new moon before. And in this case, this full moon in Capricorn, I also know that the last new moon and the next new moon happen to both be in Cancer, right? So I was having a little bit of a think about what that might mean, thinking about wanting to not just be in the same place as I was in the last new moon at this next new moon, but wanting to find the resonances there perhaps. And so, this is a place where you can get personal, right? You can think about what's going on in your life that these moon cycles and characteristics and moon features might be speaking to, and incorporate that right into the spread for yourself, right? In ways that no spread created by someone else will be able to take into account your life. And that may, someone might tell me that this is, unobjective or whatever it is. Yep, it is, right? It is deeply and highly subjective, which I think that, the moon phase and the experience of the moon phase is. So that's fine. And so for me, I don't want to get too personal here, but for me, my last new moon reading at the new moon in Cancer, I was identifying some ways that I have been limiting myself. And what really came out of that reading was, me identifying ways that my anxiety, and some different components of my anxiety are operating right now in a way that's making me hold myself back in ways that are detrimental, in ways that my need to feel secure in particular sorts of ways, very, very new moon in Cancer there, need for these, certain elements of security manifesting in this kind of self-protectiveness, but not in a good way for me, self-protectiveness to my own detriment, right? And I'm trying to talk about these things in very general terms because, again, I don't want to get too personal, but that, that's where it is for me. And so it really felt like a nudge, like step into your power, let yourself do that, let yourself be powerful, and don't, put up, boundaries are important, but don't put up these kind of walls that are not good for you, right? This is what the cards were telling me at the last new moon. So that's going to inform my design of my full moon in Capricorn spread, right? Coming into step 5. And step 5 I've just called bring it all together. And here's where you really design the spread for yourself, right? And so this is where you kind of do some math, right? You add up what you understand about the moon and your associations with the moon, what the moon means, what the transiting moon means to you, the moon's phase, any features of the moon or other elements you want to include, and you, right? You and your trajectory and where you're at. And you add all of that together, and then you get creative and you make the spread for yourself. And there is not a right way here. And any approach that you like to reading tarot, or you could use oracle cards too, whatever you like, is totally fine here, right? Maybe you want to come up with one question and just draw some cards without specific spread positions. That's totally fine. Maybe you want to come up with some spread positions and draw one card each. Great. Maybe you want spread positions, draw 2 cards each. This is usually what I do, is 2 cards per spread position. I think that's great too, right? Maybe you want a large spread. Maybe you want a small one. It's all great, right? But the idea is that you will have something that is personal, that speaks to you and where you're at and what your needs are, even some that you might not be totally conscious of yet, right? And in order to draw those out in the best way. And so when I'm doing the kind of bring it together, I think about how many cards I want, and usually I'll do maybe four spread positions with 2 cards each. So that would be 8, or maybe 5, and that'll be 10 cards. I also think about other things that I might want to include. So I have a deck called Arcana of Astrology by Claire Goodchild of Black and the Moon. This deck is actually going mass market, I believe. And I like to pull out some cards and put them in the center of my reading. So I'll pull out the full moon card, which you can see there. And I'll pull out the lunar eclipse card, because that's relevant right now as well. And I'll pull out the Capricorn the Capricorn card, and I'll put those in the middle of where I'm doing my reading. I like that visually, and I like having a kind of visual anchor. But this is also great because if you're like me and sometimes you like to take a picture of your readings, if I have this in the middle, then I know what I was doing, right? when the picture gets lost in my camera or in my phone and I find it later, I know, oh, this was a full moon in Capricorn reading, right? So I like to have that there. You think about how many cards you want and all of that, and again, there's no right answers. And a good way to do this, and it sounds maybe a bit silly or whatever, is actually visualizing the math, right? So just making a chart like this, and here I've just put phase plus features plus me. And so that I can have all of those kind of keywords and ideas all on one page, and I can just see, well, how does this all add up together? And what might that look like if this is representative of what I want to explore, right? And again, no right way, right? And so at the end of this process, what I've come up with for myself for this full moon in Capricorn with a lunar eclipse is 5 questions, which will be the basis of my spread. And I'm just reading off of a document here that I've written. So if I'm looking, that's why. I probably should have said that at the start of the video, right? Yeah. So I've come up with 5 questions for my spread. And again, of course you can use these questions. Of course you can use them as inspiration, but that is really not the purpose of this video. Hopefully I've made a case now of why designing your own spreads can be a really great, personal exercise to do. But I will share that my 5 questions for my full moon in Capricorn reading are: number 1, what does empowerment feel like? And I always like, and this is just a personal quirk, I like to start with more general questions and then get more specific as I go. I don't have a justification for why that is. It's just something that I prefer. So what does empowerment feel like? this may seem like a really nebulous question, but I think that, in a society that really is not empowering of everyone, it's easy to lose sight of. It's easy for me to lose sight of. So what does empowerment feel like? And the second question, how can I best empower myself now, right? Both timely and action-oriented. Number 3, what self-imposed limitations am I ready to let go of now? So here I've built on my new moon reading from previously, where I was identifying that self-imposed limitations are a problem, right? And I've been kind of working on that, figuring out exactly what that is. And so what self-imposed limitations am I ready to let go of now at the full moon? It's a time of, releasing before that waning cycle. Question number 4, what does self-control feel like for me when it's at its best, right? And control or self-control is one of my terms that I had associated with Capricorn, so that's coming in there. This is also, again, for me looking backwards to my prior reading where I was identifying in myself some self-control and, wanting to control my life issues that were not great, right? So what does self-control look like when it's at its best as opposed to not so good? That's an important thing for me to want to think about right now. And finally, the last question, what concrete actions can I take in the coming weeks, so during the waning moon cycle, to maintain boundaries that serve me well, right? Maintain boundaries that serve me well as opposed to make me feel limited or disempowered or restricted. Right? So those are the 5 questions that I came up with, and I'll probably do 2 cards each for those, and that will be what I'm doing today if you're watching this video the first day that it's been posted. So that's my video on making introspective tarot spreads for full and new moon times. I hope that it has been at least interesting. If you stuck with me for 42 minutes, wow. I really hope I was interesting. Thank you so much. And again, I want to just thank especially Maha and Maha's Treasure Box for putting together this amazing 28 Days of the Moon series that I'm so looking forward to engaging with all of the great content in. I mentioned I was filming this quite a bit ahead. I'm actually camping for a week of this 28 days, so I'll have some catch up to do in checking out everybody's wonderful videos, but I'm very much looking forward to it again, and I'm so grateful for being invited to participate in 28 Days of the Moon. Thank you so much to Maha. Thank you to you for watching. Please do feel free to engage in the comments if you have any questions for me, or if you'd like to share how you work with the moon phases, or if you incorporate the moon phases into your tarot practice at all. I would love to hear about what works for others as well. I think that this can be really interesting and insightful and can give us great ideas. Right? So yeah, again, thank you so much. I wish everybody a joyful full moon time. I hope everyone is well, and I will see you again very soon. Have a good one.